You're standing in the middle of the African savanna. The sun is absolutely merciless. It's beating down on you like it's personally angry at you for something you did in a past life. The grass is dry, the air is hot, and you, a very early version of a human being, are trying your best just to exist. You don't have sunscreen, you don't have a hat, you don't have a roof, you don't even have a proper shirt. And yet somehow, the species survived. Somehow the species eventually walked out of that brutal, scorching landscape, spread across the entire planet, and ended up looking wildly different from each other depending on where they landed. And one of the most visible differences? Skin color. But here's the question that almost nobody actually stops to ask. Why? Not why do people look different now? That part most of us have a loose understanding of. But why did it change in the first place? What was actually happening inside the bodies of ancient humans that drove this dramatic shift? And why does it matter so much that evolution literally prioritized it above thousands of other potential adaptations? Because here's the thing, skin color isn't random. It's not decoration. It's not a cosmetic accident of geography. It is one of the most finely tuned, brutally optimized survival systems that evolution has ever produced. And the story behind it is way more dramatic, way more weird, and way more fascinating than anything you probably learned in school. So buckle up. We're going all the way back. Back before cities. Back before agriculture. Back before language was anything more than grunts and gestures. Back to a time when ancient humans were just another animal trying to make it through the day without dying. Let's talk about what skin actually is before we go any further, because a lot of people treat it like it's just a wrapper, like it's the plastic packaging around the actual human being, but skin is an organ, a living, active, functioning organ, and it is doing an absolutely absurd number of things at any given moment. It's regulating your temperature, it's producing vitamin D from sunlight, it's acting as your first and most important line of defense against bacteria, parasites, and the general chaos of the outside world. It's waterproofing you. It's literally keeping your insides inside. And one of the things it does, one of the most important things for this conversation, is manage how much ultraviolet radiation gets into your body. That's where melanin comes in. Melanin is a pigment. It's produced by cells called melanocytes, and it exists in a spectrum from very light to very dark, and it determines the color of your skin, your hair, your eyes. And crucially, melanin acts as a natural sunscreen. When UV radiation from the sun hits your skin, melanin absorbs it and disperses it before it can damage the DNA in your cells. More melanin means more protection from UV radiation. Less melanin means less protection. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the first ancient humans, the ones walking around in sub-Saharan Africa roughly 2 million years ago, they were not walking around with dark skin. This might surprise you. This is one of those facts that makes people stop and go, wait, really? But yes, based on what we know about our closest primate relatives, the earliest versions of our ancestors likely had lighter skin under their fur, much like chimpanzees today have pale pink skin beneath their body hair. So the skin wasn't dark to start with. It became dark. And why? Because something happened. Something very important happened to ancient human bodies around 1.2 million years ago. Give or take, and it changed everything. They started losing their hair. Now this is the part of the story that sounds simple, but is actually profoundly consequential. Ancient humans began losing the thick body hair that their primate ancestors had relied on for protection, and this was probably driven by the need to cool down more efficiently. When you are a hunter-gatherer running after prey across an open savanna for hours on end, which is exactly what ancient humans were doing in a technique called persistence hunting, where you literally just chase an animal until it collapses from exhaustion, you generate an enormous amount of heat. Your body needs to dump that heat fast, or you overheat and die. Hair, ironically, gets in the way of that. Hair traps heat. So losing body hair was actually a major evolutionary advantage. It meant ancient humans could sweat more efficiently, cool down faster, and outendure basically every other animal in the heat. But it came with a catastrophic downside. Now your skin is exposed, directly exposed, to the African sun, which, as we established, is not playing around. Without that protective layer of fur, UV radiation was hitting bare skin for the first time, and UV radiation is dangerous. Not just in the sunburn, it's uncomfortable kind of way. Dangerous in the it destroys folate in your body, damages your DNA, causes cancer, and threatens your ability to reproduce kind of way. This is where the evolutionary pressure kicked in hard. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is absolutely essential for human reproduction. It's critical for the development development of a healthy fetus, for the formation of the neural tube, for cell division. When UV radiation breaks down folate in the body of a pregnant woman, the consequences can be devastating. Neural tube defects, miscarriage, failed pregnancies. This isn't a minor inconvenience. This is an existential threat to the continuation of the species. So evolution did what evolution does. It selected for individuals who were better protected against this threat. The ancient humans whose melanocytes produced more melanin, who had darker skin, were better protected from UV radiation. They retained more folate. Their pregnancies were more successful. Their children survived more often, and those children inherited the genes for darker skin. Over many generations, across the relentless pressure of natural selection, the gene pool of ancient humans living in sub-Saharan Africa shifted. Darker skin became dominant. This happened remarkably quickly in evolutionary terms. Within a few 100,000 years, which sounds like a long time but is basically the blink of an eye on the evolutionary timescale, ancient humans in Africa had developed the darker skin tones we associate with that region today. And here's something that scientists actually confirmed through genetic research that is kind of mind-blowing. The specific gene variants associated with darker skin in humans appear to have emerged at least 3 to 4 times independently in different human populations in Africa. Evolution didn't just solve this problem once, it solved it multiple times because the pressure was that strong. That's how serious the UV radiation threat was. That's how much it mattered. Now at this point in the story, ancient humans are thriving. They've got dark skin, they're sweating efficiently, they're hunting across the savannah, they're doing great. But the story doesn't stop there, because ancient humans don't stay in Africa. Around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, the exact timeline is still being refined as new archaeological evidence comes in, ancient humans began migrating. They walked out of Africa in small groups, spreading into the Middle East, into Asia, into Europe, and as they moved further from the equator, everything changed, including the sunlight. Here's the thing about UV radiation that most people don't realize. It varies enormously depending on where you are on the planet. At the equator, UV radiation is intense, year-round, relentless. But as you move toward the poles, UV radiation decreases significantly. At high latitudes, think Scandinavia, northern Russia, Iceland, UV levels are so low that for several months of the year, you can barely produce any vitamin D from sun exposure at all, even if you're standing outside for hours. And this is where the other side of the coin comes in. We talked about how too much UV radiation is dangerous because it destroys folate. But here's the other problem. You need some UV radiation, because UV radiation is how your body produces vitamin D. Vitamin D is essential for life. It regulates calcium and phosphorus absorption, which means it's essential for bone health. It supports the immune system. It's involved in muscle function. Without sufficient vitamin D, ancient humans developed conditions like rickets, where bones literally soften and deform. They got more infections, immune function collapsed, infant mortality spiked. Mothers with severe vitamin D deficiency had narrowed pelvises due to bone deformation, which made childbirth catastrophically dangerous, often fatal. So here's the brutal paradox that ancient humans stumbled into when they left Africa. Dark skin is fantastic for blocking UV radiation and protecting folate in high UV environments. But in low UV environments, dark skin is almost too good at its job. It blocks so much UV radiation that the body can't produce enough vitamin D. Ancient humans who migrated to northern Europe or northern Asia with darker skin were at a significant disadvantage. They weren't getting enough vitamin D. Their bones were weaker, their immune systems were compromised, their births were more dangerous, their children died more often, and evolution once again applied pressure, relentlessly, mercilessly, the way evolution always does. This time, the selection went the other direction. Ancient humans in lower UV environments who had slightly less melanin, whose skin was slightly lighter, could produce more vitamin D. They were healthier. They reproduced more successfully. Their children survived at higher rates, and those children inherited the genes for lighter skin. So over thousands of generations, as ancient humans spread across the planet into wildly different UV environments, their skin pigmentation adapted to match those environments. Near the equator, high UV levels kept skin dark to protect folate. Far from the equator, low UV levels favored lighter skin to allow adequate vitamin D production. It's a balance, a deeply elegant, brutally practical balance between two essential biological needs that happen to be in direct tension with each other. But wait, because this story has more layers than you think, and this is where it starts getting genuinely weird and surprising. Let's talk about the timeline, because the timeline of skin color adaptation in ancient humans is not what most people expect. When ancient humans first left Africa and began spreading into Europe and Asia around 70,000 years ago, did their skin lighten immediately? Did it happen right away? No. And this is the part that really messes with people's intuitions. It took a surprisingly long time. Genetic evidence suggests that ancient populations in Europe retained relatively darker skin for tens of thousands of years after they arrived. Some studies have suggested that ancient Europeans were still carrying skin pigmentation genes associated with darker tones as recently as 8,000 years ago, which in evolutionary terms is practically last week. So what happened? What pushed the shift toward lighter skin in Europe in a more significant way more recently? Two things, possibly three. The first is the simple passage of time and accumulated evolutionary pressure. The vitamin D deficiency problem didn't go away. Every generation in northern latitudes faced the same disadvantage if their skin was blocking too much UV, and the selection pressure kept working, kept shifting gene frequencies across thousands of years. The second is diet. This is fascinating. Ancient humans, particularly those living in coastal areas or near rivers, supplemented their vitamin D through food. Fatty fish, marine mammals, certain animal livers, these are all rich sources of dietary vitamin D. And if you're getting vitamin D through your food, the evolutionary pressure on your skin to produce it through sunlight is reduced. You can maintain darker skin in a lower UV environment and still get enough vitamin D because you're eating it. But then something dramatic happened around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution, and suddenly the diet of ancient humans in Europe shifted significantly toward grain-based foods. Wheat, barley, legumes, these are great carbohydrate sources. They're terrible sources of vitamin D. So the dietary buffer that had been partly compensating for lower sunlight was gone, and the vitamin D deficiency pressure intensified. This, many researchers believe, is part of why the genetic signatures for lighter skin in European populations seem to intensify and spread more rapidly in the period after the adoption of agriculture. The change in diet amplified the evolutionary pressure that was already there. And the third factor? Cold. Because cold climates come with thick clothing. Thick clothing covers your skin. Covered skin can't produce vitamin D even when sunlight is available. So ancient humans in colder environments were doubly disadvantaged. Less UV and less skin exposure to whatever UV was there, which doubled down on the selection pressure for lighter skin that could make the most of every scrap of sunlight that did reach it. Now, here's something that genuinely surprised researchers when they first started piecing this together. The genes responsible for lighter skin in different populations around the world are often completely different genes. Think about that for a second. Ancient Europeans and ancient East Asians both have lighter skin compared to ancient Africans or ancient Australians, but the genetic pathways that produce that lighter skin are largely distinct. European light skin and East Asian light skin evolved independently. Different mutations, different genes, producing a similar visible result for similar evolutionary reasons. This is called convergent evolution, and it happens when the same selective pressure, in this case, the need to optimize vitamin D production in lower UV environments, drives independent genetic solutions in isolated populations. It's like evolution came up with the answer to the same problem in two different languages. Same result, completely different mechanism. And on the flip side, the genetic variants responsible for darker skin in sub-Saharan Africans, in ancient Melanesians, in indigenous Australian populations, these are also often different. Multiple independent origins for high melanin production, all solving the same folate protection problem in different ways. There's a beautiful, almost poetic logic to it. The planet is not uniform. UV radiation is not uniform. And so the human beings who spread across this non-uniform planet developed non-uniform solutions to the non-uniform challenges they faced. All of them were right for their environment. None of them were better or worse in any absolute sense. They were all just answers to local questions. Let's zoom in on a few specific populations because the details are extraordinary. Take the Inuit people of the Arctic. They live in one of the most extreme low UV environments on the planet. By everything we've discussed so far, they should have evolved extremely light skin to maximize vitamin D production. But they haven't. Their skin is relatively darker than you might expect for their latitude. Why? Because they eat extraordinary amounts of fatty fish and marine mammals. Their traditional diet is absolutely packed with vitamin D. They don't need their skin to produce it because they're getting it in abundance through food. So the evolutionary pressure toward lighter skin in their environment was counteracted by the dietary source of vitamin D. Fascinating. Now look at ancient populations from South Asia. UV levels in South Asia are high, comparable in many regions to East Africa. And yet there's significant variation in skin tones across the subcontinent, shaped by thousands of years of population movement, mixture, and local adaptation to highly varied terrain and UV environments. Or consider ancient populations in the Himalayas, living at extreme altitude where UV radiation is actually more intense because there's less atmosphere to filter it, and where skin adaptations have followed their own unique trajectory shaped by that high altitude UV environment. Every population has a story, every variation has a reason, and the reasons are almost always about this fundamental tension. Protect the folate, produce the vitamin D, do both as efficiently as possible given the local conditions. Now let's take a step back and ask a broader question, because we've been talking about all of this in terms of adaptation and survival, and it's all correct and fascinating. But here's something worth sitting with. The entire observable range of human skin color, from the deepest melanin-rich tones to the palest, most UV-sensitive complexions, represents only about 6% variation in the human genome. 6%. The genetic differences between a person with the darkest skin on Earth and a person with the lightest are almost trivially small compared to everything that makes them both human. Their immune systems, their brain structures, their cardiovascular systems, their capacity for language and thought and emotion and creativity, these are essentially identical. The skin color variation that seems so visually dramatic, so socially weighted, so historically burdened is, on the genetic level, almost nothing. Evolution was solving a very narrow, very specific problem. How do you manage UV radiation in this particular environment? And the solution it came up with was a superficial adjustment to a single organ. Everything underneath stayed the same. That's worth holding on to. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in these conversations: the role of ancient women specifically in this evolutionary story. Because here's the thing, the folate connection isn't gender neutral. Folate is critical for all humans, but the catastrophic consequences of folate depletion fall disproportionately on ancient women who are pregnant. Neural tube defects in the developing fetus, failed pregnancies. The evolutionary pressure to protect folate was therefore, in a very real sense, disproportionately a pressure on skin pigmentation in ancient women. There's actually a fascinating evolutionary hypothesis, though still debated, that women across many populations have historically had slightly lighter skin than men from the same population. One proposed explanation is that the competing pressure to produce vitamin D, which is critical for calcium absorption during pregnancy and breastfeeding, created a slight selective advantage for somewhat lighter skin in ancient women to allow marginally more vitamin D production during the intense biological demands of reproduction. Meanwhile, the folate protection pressure in high UV environments maintained somewhat darker skin in men who were less directly threatened by the folate-fetus connection. The biology of reproduction shaped the evolution of skin tone in ancient women in ways that are still being teased apart by researchers today. Ancient women were not passive bystanders in this evolutionary story. Their bodies, their pregnancies, their biological demands were some of the central engines driving these adaptations. And this connects to something even broader. Ancient humans weren't evolving in a vacuum. They were evolving in a complex, shifting world where climate changed, where migration routes opened and closed, where dietary options varied with the seasons and the landscape. Skin color adaptation was happening alongside adaptations in immune function, in metabolism, in lactase persistence for digesting milk, in altitude tolerance, in heat and cold regulation. The body was evolving as a system, and skin color was one highly visible piece of an enormously complex puzzle. There's a particular piece of evidence that I want to draw attention to because it's one of my favorite examples of how precise and how recent our understanding of ancient human skin color has become. In 2018, researchers extracted ancient DNA from a Mesolithic European hunter-gatherer known as Cheddar Man, a skeleton found in Somerset, England, dated to around 10,000 years ago. When they analyzed his genome and reconstructed his likely appearance, the results made headlines worldwide. Cheddar Man, who had been living in what is now Britain 10,000 years ago, had dark skin, blue eyes, dark, curly hair. He looked nothing like the light-skinned, fair-haired image that many people had assumed represented ancient Europeans, and he was genuinely British. His mitochondrial DNA has living descendants in England today. The point is not that this was shocking. The point is that it beautifully illustrates the timeline. 10,000 years ago in Northern Europe, lighter skin had not yet become dominant. The transition was still underway. The ancient world was much more varied in appearance than we often imagine, and the particular arrangements of traits we associate with modern populations are recent, dynamic, and still evolving. Skin color is not fixed. It was never fixed. It has been continuously adjusting, adapting, responding to environmental pressures for as long as ancient humans have existed. And given that those environmental pressures are now shifting, urbanization, dietary change, global mobility, there's no reason to assume that the process has stopped. Now let's talk about something that the fossil record hints at, something that is part of the ongoing investigation into ancient human biology, the variation that existed within ancient populations living in the same region. When we talk about ancient humans in Africa having dark skin, we're talking about a general trend shaped by selection pressure. But evolution is not a light switch, it's a distribution. Even in high UV sub-Saharan Africa, there were individuals with slightly different melanin levels, slightly different UV tolerance. And in populations that had been isolated for long periods in different microenvironments, coastal zones, dense forests with heavy canopy cover, high-altitude plateaus, local adaptations could produce visible differences even within the same broad geographic region. The San people of southern Africa, for instance, have skin that is often somewhat lighter than other sub-Saharan African populations, and genetic analysis has confirmed that the San are one of the oldest and most genetically distinct human lineages on Earth, having diverged from other populations very early. Their skin pigmentation reflects thousands of years of adaptation to their specific southern African environment, including more variable UV conditions than the equatorial zone. The point is, even the story of African skin pigmentation is not a single story. It's a continent of enormous size and enormous environmental diversity, and ancient humans adapted to all of it in ways that produced real, measurable variation. And this brings us to something genuinely important for how we understand ancient humans overall. They were not simple. They were not uniform. They were not some crude early draft of modern people. They were fully formed human beings navigating an enormously complex world, with bodies that were beautifully, elegantly, sometimes brutally adapted to their specific circumstances. The variation in their skin color was not random noise. It was signal. It was information encoded in biology about where they lived, what they ate, what challenges they faced, and how successfully they solved those challenges. Every skin tone that exists in the world today is a message from the past, a record of the environments that ancient humans inhabited, the UV levels they experienced, the diets they ate, the migrations they undertook. Every variation is a story of survival. And here's the kicker. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about this. We carry all of that history in our skin, literally. The melanin levels in your body, however much or however little you have, are the result of thousands of generations of ancient humans living, struggling, adapting, reproducing, and dying in particular parts of the world. Your skin color is not a category. It is not a classification. It is a timeline. It is a map. It is a piece of biological text written by evolution across hundreds of thousands of years of human experience. The ancient humans standing in the African savanna at the beginning of this story, losing their fur, facing the brutal African sun, beginning to darken to protect their folate and their unborn children. They were the beginning of a process that eventually produced every human being alive today. Every complexion, every tone, every variation. All of it traces back to those ancient bodies trying to solve the same fundamental problem. How do you live under this particular sky in this particular place? And the answer was written into the skin, again and again and again.